Hi, this is Bob Samuels, founder of TechConnectr. TechConnectr is a marketplace and campaign management platform of best-of-breed account-based marketing lead generation solutions. We've partnered with the B2B Marketing Exchange to bring you wisdom from leading account-based marketing thought leaders. To that end, I'm happy to introduce you to David Fortino, Senior Vice President of Audience and Product at NetLine Corporation. I've known David for more years than I care to mention, from our days at NetLine. David's always been aware of cutting-edge technology and best practices solutions in B2B marketing. His presentation on lead generation through the buyer's lens was well received by a standing room only crowd at the B2B Marketing Exchange event last week. David, it's always a pleasure to speak with you. How are you today?
Doing well, Bobby. How are you? The event's been going great thus far. How's things been progressing for you over the last few days?
Wonderful event. I love it because it's great networking and it's great topics and it's people are here that want to meet other people and lots of them are relevant. Even if they're not relevant, they're really good. It's just this and Serious Decisions are my favorite too. This one's a little less pricey. But I think they're far and away above the other ones. It's been great, and I got a chance to see your presentation. That was awesome.
Thank you.
And it was standing room only. I got to sit in front of somebody, but
it was funny. I saw people sitting on the floor as well, which is always good to see, but awkward because you're panning down, looking at people on the top of their head. But it's good to see nonetheless.
Yeah. So I was just thinking, I've known you about 20 years now.
Yeah, close to it, I suppose.
Which is aging us a little bit.
A bit.
And we've seen a lot of changes in this industry. It started off, it was truly content syndication. It was putting it out there, and everybody could go after it. And it was all inbound as opposed to outbound.
Absolutely.
And it switched.
Yeah, and even at that time, a lot of the content syndication campaigns were mostly unfiltered. It was about just simply amplification of content, maybe targeting audiences, very light filtering. The marketers' expectations were somewhat lenient, perhaps even infantile at that stage, right? It was a very early idea for that model and execution. People were still kind of first coming from display and used to buying traffic and buying media. And so they were kind of treating content syndication and lead gen with still that media lens. But obviously things have changed quite a bit. So I'm sure we're going to dig into that a little bit now.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it started with you take whatever you got, throw out, filter out the junk, the Mickey Mouse and the unemployed and the students. But you got what you got, and then people said, okay, so I want filters. Fine, you'll pay for filters, and you'll pay that much more for each filter. Then I want specific companies. So now they didn't call it at the time, but that was ABM.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, as we all know, and I'm sure a bunch of your other sessions have all spoke about this, I mean, ABM as an idea, an execution, a practice is not a new idea. How it's deployed today is obviously very different than the idea that perhaps started 100 years ago of having accounts that someone was specifically targeting. The difference of knocking on doors versus delivering pixels these days is very different, but the conceptual idea of having key accounts that you are looking to gain traction and or win is still very much of a fundamental business application across every industry around the world, regardless of your scope, size, and or product.
And I forgot to really give you a good introduction of you, and I apologize. I forgot people don't know you as well as I do. But could you tell us a little bit about your background and what you've seen along the way, and what you've learned, and some of the cool things that you can share about the way people do things right?
Sure. So, Bobby said, I'm Dave Fortino. I'm SVP of Audience and Product and Marketing at NetLine. I've been in the space my entire career. Straight out of college, I was lucky enough to find myself at a .com kind of 1.0 startup called VerticalNet. I was the B2B poster child back then. Typical rise and fall story, went public, massive success, massive crash, private jets, amazing parties, all kinds of stuff. Looking back at that period of my life and career, I always tell everyone that moment really taught me everything about what not to do as a professional, as a marketer, as now an executive, it really didn't teach me a lot of the things to do. But it was an amazing experience. And then through VerticalNet, I was able to really learn about NetLine very early on in NetLine's life, and decided to make the move over to NetLine. Once I was done at VerticalNet, we had sold off a business unit. I was part of the management team there and then left. Yeah, looking backwards on my stay here at NetLine, it's been a phenomenal ride. I'm still excited about where we're going. We've processed, I believe now, over 46 million, 47 million leads in aggregate for business. We typically are processing around 800,000 gated asset leads per month. Many of them are ABM specific, and we can kind of unpack some of that. That process is kind of amazing to see, in the sense that we are in this, I view it very much akin to kind of being in a control tower, whereby we're managing thousands of campaigns. There's typically about 8,000 assets live on the platform at any given time, representing hundreds of different vendors all around the world, different industries, and so on. So we're in the unique position to have a ton of observations around what works, what doesn't work, who's creative, who's falling behind. Sometimes you'd be shocked to see the most successful public companies are some of those that are perhaps more conservatively deploying tactics and strategies. Some of the more innovative startups tend to be approaching things a bit more differently. But yeah, it's been a great point of exposure and learning. And to me, that's been probably the most exciting part of my job, is being exposed to so many bright marketers acting as our clients. We inherently just get smarter and smarter every day by working with these folks.
You are in a very nice position to work with some of the best. So do you have some examples of some folks, if you can name names, that's good, or ideas of successes that you've seen around ABM? And
yeah, I'll probably refrain from naming names since I didn't get a approval for this. I think some of the more innovative approaches has not just been about an ABM strategy, right? Because I think everyone's deploying that in some capacity, and they're probably doing it across channels and perhaps across multiple vendors too. So there's everything from more programmatic and display-oriented deployments. There's email-oriented ABM strategies. And that's both inbound and outbound. There's nurture path specific to ABM. But to me, where the matrix of ABM success really comes into play is as you layer that over with content ideation and curation and publishing. It's not enough to simply target accounts successfully across channels, but specifically speak to those accounts differently. And so you're starting to get into personalization ideas, but you're also getting into influencer type ideas as well, whereby that one piece of content or landing page that you're trying to drive people to, that was acceptable a few years ago now when you're targeting an account. But now by targeting a single account, you're inherently targeting a ton of different people in that account that are influencing that decision. Having a solitary piece of content or landing page and supporting materials isn't enough. You need to be specifically speaking to the pain points of individually the different stakeholders in that company that is your targeted account, and why perhaps the finance person needs to understand things a little bit more differently about you, your solutions, and obviously your price point for them, and what the proposed ROI is going to be versus the marketer and or perhaps C-suite decision makers. The companies that I've seen deploy successfully in a more creative fashion are leveraging those ideas, whereby it's not just this idea that here's my target account list, here's 5 assets that we're using to try to engage with these people, and we're going to promote them via a multitude of channels and outreach and call it a day there. And then they're going into a nurture path, which is the exact same nurture path that every other lead goes into. They're just simply calling this the ABM one. To me, that's rather sophisticated. Rather juvenile in approach. The more sophisticated deployments are actually just more or less kind of getting rid of that connection to traditional nurture paths and treating ABM as if it's just another flow of inbound leads, but very much kind of working from the ground up with a new paradigm and new approach to these accounts specifically.
Beautiful. And speaking of paradigm, the topic of your speech yesterday was along the lines of marketing with With the customer's lens in mind?
Correct.
What do you
Buyer's
mean by
lens.
that? What do you
Yeah.
mean by the buyer's lens?
Yeah, so I got into that a little bit yesterday during our session here at B2BMX, and it's a big misstep, regardless of your strategy, whether it's ABM or content syndication, even display, I would say, and we don't really play there, but you still see it all the time. And that marketers, you get so entrenched of thinking of all the various stakeholders inside your own company that you start losing touch of your actual customers and thinking about things through their eyes and through their lens. So we playfully made everybody wear NetLine branded sunglasses in our session yesterday to get people to kind of quickly come up to speed that they need to be thinking about things through their own buyer's lens versus their own. It's a very simple idea, but one that sadly gets ignored or diluted by the time campaigns get executed. And that's a challenge that I'd raise to most marketers, is constantly remind yourself to think of yourself as, if I am the buyer, if I am the prospect, how am I going to feel? What are my emotions connected to this asset? What resonates with me with this landing page? Why would I perhaps want to reach out and ask for a demo or learn more or download this piece of content or watch your 45-minute webinar? Those are all big asks of people. Everyone's incredibly busy. You've got to be providing, answers to their problems. Content allows you to do so quite easily, but if you're not thinking of their pain points, it becomes very challenging. And you start sounding just like a echo chamber of all of your internal constituents, right? The CMO needs you to say one thing to the market. You're getting pressure from your director about saying this other thing, and perhaps there's even a phrase that needs to be repeated. All of those things, at the end of the day, you're kind of making decisions, and before you know it, you've launched a campaign that's completely diluted from what the buyer really wants you to say, what they're looking for. And from there, that becomes problematic, and then you're looking at KPIs that don't make sense, and so on.
Very challenging. Thank you. So you also talked about content and maybe personalizing content toward the person. It can't be every single piece of content or the white paper, the case study can't be exactly specifically rewritten for every audience, but maybe for groups, or
absolutely.
Where do you draw the line?
So I think right there, it's important to understand the influencers within your targeted accounts. And so it's not enough to say, okay, I'm targeting marketers who are managers and above in companies of 500 employees and greater, and also here's my target account list. You need to understand all of the various people along that path, so it's not just a one standard default persona anymore that makes sense. Buyers committees within these organizations are quite complicated. Not only are they typically multifunctional across departments, but they're also multi-level. And so the concerns of perhaps a manager or maybe even like an individual contributor on their team who's very execution and tactically oriented, their needs are completely different, right? They're not thinking about the strategic ROI of making a decision. They're not thinking about your viability as a company and your customer roster and so on. Those are all different pieces of content that need to find homes with the appropriate person who's making decisions that are relevant to those values. And so when you talk about personalization, sometimes, yes, it could mean actually trying to tailor content that specifically references their brand dynamically, specifically references their name, things like that. But to me, that's kind of very primitive, right? Those are attributes that you should be able to have access to, especially if this is an outbound effort based upon internal databases that you've already accumulated with prospects. Very simple to deploy. But when you start going into this notion of that being more than one persona in your campaign, that's a great opportunity to start thinking differently. And so I had a question during that session yesterday of how do you go about doing that if you don't really know these people? And so my suggestion always with marketers is to be involved in that sales process as much as possible, and not the internal process. It's the outside process. Be there. If nothing else, listen to customers. If possible, talk to customers as well during the actual selling cycle. Really understand their pain points. They will gladly tell you that, yeah, my CMO is adamant that we are not investing in this type of technology, or we're not going this way with our stack, whatever it might be. Conversely, they will say our CFO has deep concerns about these types of companies and or expenditures over certain amounts. If we can find a way to slide in under that, then we can tend to work somewhat independently and autonomously. You get to IT complications if you're talking about anything that's being installed or touching another stack that relates internally, so you should have documentation speaking to those complexities, and so on. And so once you understand the hurdles that exist within your typical persona and also your targeted accounts, those are learnings that you get to extract and kind of somewhat replicate, right? Every company is going to be different. There's going to be a different Jane or Jim who is always the obstructionist. There's always going to be that person. You're always going to hate them. The reality is, though, once you understand what makes that person tick, then you can create content that really will do your best to appease those concerns.
That's great. One of the other things I liked about your presentation was the concept of allowing the target person, the persona, to tell you where they're at in their journey.
Absolutely. Yeah, so oftentimes we as marketers tend to approach content as a way of obviously creating engagement with prospects, but we create content speaking to the journey without really thinking about allowing the users to vocalize where they're at in the journey. We think that's maybe perhaps for sales to do, or based upon enough intent being scored out that this user is then escalated over a threshold and then gets to sales. But users, if done elegantly, will actually self-select and deliver their intent based upon the types of content that you're publishing. And so if you're always arming your sales team with perhaps down funnel or mid funnel content, and it's never publicly exposed, surely you'll never generate a deeper, more engaged, higher intent lead off of perhaps your own site, your blog, your social feeds, and so on. Because you never gave these users the chance to even find it. And so it gets to some ideas around how do you bubble up some of that content, make it more accessible both on an inbound and outbound strategy, but also how do you align content to the journey in a way that the users don't feel like they're making those decisions and letting you know where they stand by positioning the content in a way that allows the users to see this in somewhat of a library type environment, but abbreviate it, right? Have a few pieces focused on discovery and awareness, a few pieces focused on consideration, and then ultimately decision. From there, it's amazing simply by doing that. And if you design the resources correctly and position the page concisely, you're able to extract phenomenal learnings. A recent test of ours showed that simply by having a multitude of assets speaking to different stages of the journey, without asking the users, without vocalizing that this asset is more aligned to making a final decision, we were able to gain a 31% increase in discovery of where these users actually exist in their journey without ever asking a question. There wasn't a custom question needed, not a phone call, nothing. It's simply about accessibility to that content.
That's a beautiful concept. It's self-selection, and they get what they need. It's a wonderful concept, and it's very elegant. It's a beautiful thing. So what are your thoughts about ABM? What are some of the misconceptions that are around today as far as ABM, and where do you think it's heading 1 year from now, 5 years from now? What's your crystal ball say on that?
So we'll start with the some of my perceptions and misconceptions about ABM today. So there's a few different strategies that are being deployed. And I think at a high level, you can kind of relate it to there's first inbound and outbound philosophies approaching ABM. I'll probably speak more about outbound related strategies first. And so a lot of the industry has really moved towards programmatically oriented display executions. A lot of that is around almost every session here, you're hearing about intent and signals and exhaust data and so on and so on and so on. All of it's viable, all of it is useful. The reality of it is that it does get to some complicated and or cumbersome use cases whereby you've got a user perhaps of a software suite of, I'm not going to name any of these vendors, but you're subscribing to one of these platforms. You've been alerted that company X is surging around a specific topic. That's interesting, and that's very helpful for the marketing team and sales team to know that. Now, that same vendor delivers you a multitude of contacts within that company that are likely to be the people doing that activity. The reality of it is that many times ABM campaigns, because of their very definition, tend to be very large organizations. Those large organizations also have very large teams for obvious reasons. When you're delivered a list of 3 to 5 contacts saying that this is potentially the people doing it, all it is it's saying that instead of it's a needle in a haystack, there are needles in the haystack. That you still need to figure out who the hell to contact, what's the approach. Is it helpful to know that they are actively researching around a given topic? Yes. But as I was kind of breaking down in my session yesterday, that's all third-party data. To me, the biggest fallacy of that value prop of those being leads is that those users never knowingly took part of that process. They were on a website, they were on Forbes maybe, and they were reading an article about, I don't know, internet over technology, marketing automation, semiconductor processing. It could be a million things. The fact that they were on that page, if there's enough activity associated to that, that's a surge of their activity associated to that account. Now, what's interesting there is that it really doesn't take into consideration true depth of intent and engagement. So viewing a web page, even if you viewed 20 of them, there's no way in hell I would articulate that to the same level of intent as sitting through a 45-minute webinar that was scheduled at 2 p.m. Eastern, right? You've blocked out a slot of your day. You've registered for that. You've personally said that I am Dave Fortino. I'm attending this webinar. I'm volunteering information and my time to do this, versus casually perusing content and perhaps never even finishing it. But showing an indication that you're interested is fine. But beyond that, I think there's a big disparity between what people believe they're getting from some ABM solutions and what they really are getting. First-party data versus third-party data is a completely different use case. I'm not arguing against third-party validity. I think it does serve a purpose, but it's really important to level set your expectations as to what that is, what you're getting, versus what you were sold in some cases. I think that story is not all that clear. That's unfortunate, because I think our industry pays the price for that collectively across the board. There's a ton of confusion. Specifically at this event, there's a lot of vendors talking about ABM. I've had people come over talking to us flat out saying they can't tell the difference between most of the vendors here. So that's a question mark and a challenge to all of us as to how do we separate not only our value props, but our true value that we deliver to these organizations, and make it clear what they're getting, what they're not getting, what is smoke and mirrors, what is real. Sadly, marketers are phenomenal at telling very creative stories, and that's a great thing, and it's also a curse, right? Because a lot of times our customers really truly don't understand one vendor from the next without really digging in more deeply. I think your next part of your question was about where things are going. I wish I had true answers here. I've got some thoughts. First off, I think there's going to be massive consolidation, specifically in the programmatic side of the industry. There are far too many vendors selling the exact same product, period. They all know it. Most of them are VC backed, so it is a race to the end. At some point, someone will be claimed the leader, and then there'll be a momentary kind of collapse of that story for a while. It's very akin to kind of social and perhaps mobile. Those things never went away. They become part of our tool set. They are no longer viewed as the sexy, shiny object, though. They are just day-to-day what we do.
And actually, to that point, there seems to be some consolidation going on the data side too.
Absolutely. Yeah, on the data side is this part of the industry I don't pay enough attention to. I know all the players. Being that we don't really ingest much of that, it's a little bit outside of my scope on a day-to-day basis. But that's true, and that's also a similar observation, right? There were a ton of companies running around, and they all say they've got the best database in the world. And it's like, so my first question is like, where's that data from? How did you go about building this database? And how on earth and why do you guys all have 40 million leads? How is that possible? Is there really, is everyone leaving with the database when they go find their new job? I don't know. And Bobby's laughing at me right now. But yeah, these are questions I have. And that gets back to like the buyer's lens, right? Where if you're the buyer of data from any of these companies for any use case, even if you're not using it for marketing purposes, let's say you're just using it for research, how do you tell the difference between any of these vendors? They all seemingly have phenomenal pedigrees, very bright people, nicely designed websites, great customer rosters. They all have those 40 million records. How do I tell the difference between them? I don't know. I quite honestly don't know. I could look at their history and perhaps their presence in the space to say, okay, some are more legitimate than others, but I don't know how you tell the difference between perhaps testing.
I keep talking about that.
Yeah.
The bake-off.
Yeah, and I don't know if they'd show up. So that would be my question: is would they? So the consolidation on the data side is certainly there. The consolidation, I think, on the ABM side is likely. The bigger questions, though, relate to what kind of implication, especially when you're talking about third-party deployment of ABM strategies. What implications are looming, not globally, because everybody knows about GDPR and where that's going and will continue to go, but where that will go domestically here in the States. I just saw Firefox just published guidelines for this year, 2019. Firefox, by default, will be blocking every third-party pixel. That implicates everyone's business model in programmatic, period. The question is Firefox statistically significant to cause pain for them now? I don't know. I think our percentage share of visitation from Firefox users is certainly down a ton from where it was. That said, look at Apple and where they've pivoted recently, right? They've changed their story quite a bit in that they've become a very security conscious client or customer, in the sense that they are proactively telling users that if you use an Android system, Android is inherently a data-centric model, right? You are the product when you're using an Android phone, and I'm happily doing so. That said, if you're using an Apple device, you are not. The product is the phone. You are not the product. They don't use your data. They don't sell your data. It's all somewhat walled off. They've gone through great amount of effort and pushback from the advertising industry to make that position. So take that for what it's worth. If Apple continues that direction, that's a lot of power being wielded there versus Firefox, which is a bit different. So let's say that gets rolled into Safari. Now that's another major browser. We've got a vacuum, I think, somewhere coming behind right now. Sorry about that. So we've got that. Now, the last kind of holdout, and sorry, Microsoft, I'm not acknowledging Edge. We are talking about Chrome. And so will Google take a stance against third-party pixels? I don't see how they could. Chrome is inherently connected to the Google ad stack, so there's so much, but perhaps, and if they connected it and simply said we're not accepting or firing any third-party pixels beyond Google, that's an amazing message for them to deploy. Gutsy. I don't know if they would. I don't know what kind of lobbying they'd receive back from the various ad tech players against that, but that's certainly a possibility. So I think if you're connected to those models, those are some things to be cognizant of, and I don't know how they'll play out, but I'm certain that there will be changes. I think that's the certainty.
Yeah. GDPR, that's a great point about that's going to affect ABM and significantly with the whole PII and everything.
Absolutely.
So one other thing, and I'll let you go soon. This is a good conversation, though. The difference between ABM as far as programmatic and ABM lead generation, content syndication. People get confused about what the value is or what they're getting out of it.
Yeah, so I think content syndication as a execution can be done with or without ABM targeting. Right, content syndication simply means you've got some form of content that's typically highly produced, right? It's probably not a blog post, it could be, but it's typically packaged content. So it's a file in most cases, like a PDF. It could be a webinar, it could be a podcast, it could be even a recording of something like this, whereby you are providing value and syndicating that content into relevant audience touch points across channels. So that could be web inclusions, native, mobile app inclusions, XML feeds, and so on, newsletters dynamically as well. The difference, though, is that the primary pricing model associated to all content syndication models that I'm aware of are that they're performance-based, connected back to the actual acquisition of the lead itself, versus ABM deployed through programmatic. There's typically two cost structures. One is you're paying for the access to the software suite that you're using to deploy. And then beyond that, you're also paying for media costs. And so from there, then you're challenged too with the reality of you driving users back to a form that you hope converts into a qualified lead. It's not guaranteed. That comes back to, is your form designed well? Is it responsive? Are you using predictive data? A million things to think about, versus simply contracting with vendors that are delivering qualified leads based upon users making first-party decisions to engage with your asset. Again, it's that big delta between first-party data and third-party data. Users proactively playing a role and self-identifying intent and interest to engage with your brand, versus not knowing that they're even doing this. As a salesperson, I mean, we talk to our salespeople all the time. Salespeople love talking with people that are pre-engaged and said, like, yeah, I'm interested in you. I caught your webinar. I checked out your white paper. No, it's not cold at all. Versus knowing that a company's active, knowing that they're in market, knowing all of these things are very helpful, but still for the rep, that's cold, right? You're reaching out to who you hope might be the person making that decision. Oh, it's not Jane? Oh, all right, let's go give Jim a call. Oh, it's not Jim either. You know, and you keep going, obviously, until that's your job, until you can break through. The reality, though, is that you're somewhat still guessing where to begin, where to end. And I think content syndication comes at it from the completely opposite perspective.
David, it's a pleasure. Lots of good stuff. I could talk forever.
Yeah.
If you have any couple minutes, although we're getting bombarded here with that background noise. Hope you guys are enjoying it out there. Anyway, it's a great conversation. Any parting words? Otherwise, look forward to seeing you soon.
No, I appreciate the opportunity. It's always great catching up. I've been fortunate enough to know you for a long time. It's great to catch you up out here in Arizona. So yeah, until next time, we'll probably catch up at another future event, and we'll continue to maybe unpack changes that have occurred since this one. So talk soon. Thanks.
I look forward to David. Cheers.
See ya.